Why did I want to do this session? Because firstly, I hugely enjoy emceeing, chairing, comparing, presenting, interviewing people. Secondly, because I get asked a lot for my suggestions and for my recommendations, for my practical tips, and I thought it would be helpful to download as many as possible. So we'll cover a lot in this session up until the hour. Thirdly, because to put it very bluntly, I would like to see a whole range of people doing more of what I'm lucky enough to do. And I'm particularly talking about people from all different backgrounds, all different ages, and yes, lots more men and lots more women as well in the mix. So for me, that's incredibly important. I think if you're lucky enough to have been given the mic, it's your responsibility to pass the mic. And that goes more broadly, but especially within events. So very briefly, a little bit about me, particularly in hosting. Lucky enough to get to co-host some phenomenal events, the Great British Entrepreneur Awards, the ScaleUp Institute Summit, all of the backstage, if you like, retreats for EY's Entrepreneur of the Year, some fantastic events with London and partners, including the London Business Awards. Silicon Valley comes to the UK, all of the flagship events for Tech London advocates and global tech advocates. So it really is an honor to be able to do that, and I love it. In terms of what keeps me busy, I won't bore you with all the details, but right now I'm passionate about the Turn on the Subtitles literacy campaign, and I'm getting ready to launch the next phase of something called Clean and Cool, which is supporting clean tech entrepreneurs from around the world to go global. So that's my obsession. I'm a serial co-founder, and I love connecting people and ideas. My first ever proper job was at Disney in Florida. I wasn't Mickey Mouse, by the way, thanks for asking, but I did get to meet people. I was a Butlin Redcoat 20 years ago, and became, I guess, a serial co-founder when I dropped out of not one but two universities. So I also brought the concept of speed networking to the UK for my sins. I love connecting people, and events has been where I've spent a huge number of the last few years. So why do I think you should be encouraging more people, or you yourself could be encouraged perhaps to step into doing more hosting? I think there are at least three reasons. Firstly, it's an amazing way to meet people. It really is, of all different backgrounds, all different industries. I think it's a huge opportunity to help people, to help other people, to support their organization, to support your organization by being more of a host, more of a chair, more of a compère. It's also an amazing opportunity and responsibility when you've got that mic to pass it on. Makes a huge difference. One tiny thought, the surveys and the research shows that if the first person to answer a question in a conference or event happens to be a woman, it's far more likely that women will contribute more to that conversation. So we've got a responsibility as hosts and presenters to think about not just who we pass a mic to, but how we make people feel comfortable in a room. So this is all about, for me, helping other people, but also, yes, I must confess, being a better host helps you attract opportunity as well. So this session is about my experience. It's not about being definitive. It's not saying this is the right way. It's just what's worked for me. So I'm particularly keen to sort of share that with you today. The audience, you are on a huge range. I know you might just be starting your events for the first time in terms of hosting. You might be here because you want to help others, and you might be already hosting all sorts of things and just want to have your brain sparked from a different angle. So I welcome your questions on that. Speaking of questions, it's a great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague Jess Butcher to the room. Jess is a serial tech entrepreneur. She is often best known as the co-founder of Blipper, a phenomenal story. She divides her time today between a range of advisory, board roles, angel investments. And I have to say, well, firstly, at that point, Jess, good morning.
Good morning, Oli.
It's lovely to see you. And I should say, Jess, you are a fantastic and self-trained public speaker, particularly though you're honing those skills because you host a fantastic session every Friday morning on Clubhouse at 8 o'clock. I've been to the last 3 or 4 and I think they're excellent.
Yeah, I'm trying to hone my own skills and decided to moderate a room for me to learn from and kind of open that up for everybody else to learn from. So we have a fantastic session on Friday mornings with Alex Merry, my speaker coach. He's the expert and I play the idiot foil who helps to bring up very, very smart people into the room to share their experiences.
No, not at all. Well, it's a brilliant session, 8 o'clock on Friday on Clubhouse, and Jess Butcher on Twitter. You can see the link to that. I highly recommend it. And Jess, thank you for helping me on this. I know you're going to keep an eye on the chat and on the questions as they come through. Feel free to put through questions at any time, and I'll turn to Jess periodically. But there's a lot that I want to get through, if that's all right. So if this particular session in the next 50 minutes helps you, and particularly helps you to help someone else, then I've done my job, and I'd love to get your feedback after that. So thank you for being here. In terms of how I work, yes, I do a range of different work, particularly paid, but also pro bono. So I support an awful lot of organizations, particularly charities, without charging a fee. And for you to be thinking about, as hosts, thinking about what the context of an event is that you're being asked to support. Can you make a difference to that organization? And crucially, yeah, I must confess, when I'm being approached for hosting and comparing, will I enjoy it? I think is a hugely important question. Let's kick off. I think the biggest question.
Sorry.
Yes, Jess.
Just before you jump in, can you just make me a co-host again? I gather there's some people waiting outside, and I appear to have lost those.
Of course I can. Yeah, I think I've admitted everybody, but I will make you a host now, Jess. There you go. I'm making you a host.
Thank you.
There we are. Jess Butcher is the host now. That sounds exciting. Good. All power to you. Quite right. Right. So picture the scene. You've been asked to step into a role comparing, chairing, emceeing an event. I think the single biggest question, this was some advice given to me in Cape Town by Richard Mulholland of Missing Link, one of the world's leading presentation firms. He said to me, the biggest question before you get on any stage is, how do you want the audience to feel when you've finished speaking? How do you want them to feel when you've finished speaking? And I've evolved that a little bit for MCs and comparing chairs. I think the biggest question you can ask an organization that you're comparing or chairing for is, how do we want the guests to feel when the event ends? And what do we want them to do when the event ends? Apart from saying that was brilliant. And colleagues will chuckle as I say this, because I ask it before every single event I host. How do we want them to feel, and what do we want them to do when the event ends? It's absolutely crucial. So how do I see the role of a chair, of a host? Well, some high-level thoughts on this. Firstly, I think it's getting the why, understanding the why. What is the point of this event from the organizer's perspective and from the guest's perspective? Because if you don't understand that, this can seem entirely pointless. How does it fit in to the bigger picture for the organization? And put bluntly, asking that chief exec or head of events or head of marketing, what is this event really about? And you'd be amazed at how often they forget to tell the chair or presenter the real point of the event. Is it about sending out a certain signal that London is open? Is it about courting a certain new type of supporter, non-financial institution sponsors? What's it really about? Absolutely crucial. Your second big role as a host is to make the guests and the audience feel comfortable. Okay, why? Because I think then they'll enjoy it more. But if your guests and audience members feel comfortable, they're far more likely to contribute more and in more authentic ways. So it's about reassuring, it's about recognizing them to get better contributions. So keep asking yourself, and for me, this is a huge way of dealing with nerves. I think my job is to make you feel comfortable. Makes so much sense. The third thing is, where needed, your host or your MC, and you I'm talking to when you're hosting this, is to shift the mood of a room. Shift the mood of a room. It might be to keep it perfectly on track, just as we've got it, but it might be, look, we need to switch this session up. We need to really ground it. We need to have a far more thoughtful environment. You are channeling the organizer in shifting the mood of the room. And a lot of that, no pressure, a lot of that comes down to your persona, your own personal energy. So just very briefly, what do I mean when I talk about persona? I'd like you to think personally about this in your own hosting and chairing and those that you're coaching and supporting. I'm not talking about becoming a different person on stage. I'm not talking about reinventing yourself. I'm suggesting that you ask yourself, are there certain traits of your personality that you could bring to the fore when you get on a stage, real or virtual? What are those traits? I'd encourage you to write some of those down after this. In other words, your persona when you're hosting and presenting becomes a slightly exaggerated version of yourself. It's crucial to say that I'm not suggesting there is a stereotype or a right persona for hosts, compères, MCs. It should be entirely personal. When I was at Butlins, being a redcoat in the holiday resorts, firstly, every redcoat was encouraged to be different. They didn't all have to be the loud one. Some could be the quieter, thoughtful one. Develop your own presenting persona. Crucially, though, my redcoat badge said redcoat. I changed my name to Oli, Ollie. I didn't change my name, but I changed the way it was spelt as a subtle signal to myself that this was a slightly exaggerated version of who I was. It gave me huge confidence, or quiet confidence, to know that I could go out there and meet and interact with anyone. Let's think more broadly about the role you have as a host of an event, or anyone you're encouraging to host within your organizations. Is it to shape the agenda? Very often it is, and hosts and MCs miss this opportunity. Put your hand up, say, would it be possible to shape the agenda? Is it possible to change the design of the event? How will our guests be spending their time? And don't be afraid, as you build confidence with your colleagues, to point out, I think that session might be too long. What permissions do you have as a host to affect the design of an event? Crucially, the casting of the event. Who will appear on stage? To what extent can you contribute? I'd suggest you can contribute to that far more than you think. You might even want to have certain rules or conditions that you apply. For the last several years, I will not host an all-male panel, and everyone that works with me knows this. I refuse to do it, and in almost every single case, it has turned out to be the case, which has been good. However, so I'm not seen as Mr. Awkward in those very tough conversations, I'm also able to suggest people to join panels and lineups. So we can all play our part in that. But you might not have seen your ability to affect the casting of an event. This panel looks rather white to me, wouldn't be the right way to say it, but raise your voice if you've got concerns about the diversity that you're seeing in front of you in the events. And the event organizers I work with are so good on this now. They're so mindful of this. It's really, really inspiring. So I thought I'd just take a couple of minutes to talk there about, I'm going to talk in detail about how we prepare for events and how I encourage you to think about preparing and encouraging others to prepare. But I'd be thinking, even in those early stages, what form will my brief take? Now, you work with a Rolls-Royce organization, a Seven Hills of this world, a London and Partners, you will get a formal written brief. Brilliant. But what works for you? Is it a script? Good morning, everybody. Is it bullet points? Is it, I would suggest, at all costs, alongside your briefing materials, a running order? Absolute non-negotiable, hitting those time spots. What works for you? And I would encourage you to realize you have more flexibility than you think to ask for the type of brief that works for you. Crucially, what about guest lists? Reassure the organization you're not looking for their email addresses, but it's really important for you to get a sense of who's in the room. I'm hosting a round tech on legal tech roundtable next week. Really important for me to see who's on that guest list. You can often ask for that as the host. Crucially, who on the day is calling the shots? Who on the day is calling the shots? Who's going to be your partner, if you like, in the room? Because in the planning meetings, there might be 8 people. Ask that question early. On the day, who am I going to be dealing with when it comes to cues, when it comes to timing, when it comes to everything? Crucial for you to know. Right, let me pause briefly. Jess, how are we doing? Thank you for letting everybody in.
No, I think there's nobody waiting anymore. Yeah, people seem to be enjoying it, judging by the faces I'm looking at. If people do have questions when Ollie's around talking, then please do add them into the chat function, and I will start to either group them or relay them when we get to the next pause. But this is fantastic stuff. I'm going to struggle to read the chat whilst also taking my notes, Ollie.
Well, I'm going to send you the recording. I think from the bumpy start, it might be an audio recording, which we'll edit down. But thank you, Jess, for scanning that, and do ask. No question too big or too small, and I'm very keen to share all I can. If we don't get through them, I can follow up afterwards in some sort of summary note as well, if it's useful. I hope it's useful. Right. I asked for questions in advance. A lot of people ask me, how do I prepare for an event? Again, this is my method, it's my take, it's not the way you should do it, but hopefully helpful. Right. I do a deep dive on each and every one of the guests, sometimes, yes, admittedly, to the point of obsession. So I want to go through, yes, their Twitter accounts, their YouTube, particularly YouTube. What have they spoken about before? What have they said? Don't forget, I know it sounds basic to use their name in inverted commas on YouTube, particularly if you're dealing with a common name, right? Their LinkedIn, and crucially, recent Google searches. No good just Googling, Richard Reed, founder of Innocent. That will give you the broad picture, but what about within the last week, the last month? That will give you some fresh content. Those techniques do a couple of things. Yes, of course, they help you have better conversations on stage. They also help you build rapport. So much of the intel you'll get from that Twitter feed, that LinkedIn hobbies and interests section, if you like, will give you that intel to say to a journalist on the day, I really enjoyed that piece you wrote about the Suez Canal. Yeah, now that might sound like flattering or sycophancy, but to me, it shows that you've tuned in to what they think is interesting in the world. So do those deep dives for everybody. I think it's really important to clarify as you're preparing, who's preparing the questions for this? Would you like me to do that? Are you going to do that? Or are we going to do that together? Clarity on your role, very, very important. Crucially, who is going to be briefing the speakers? Is it you as a host? Is it the organization? I prefer all of the briefing, just my view, I prefer all of the briefing on venue, logistics, location, who, what, why, when, where, to be done by somebody else, by another organization. I'm very happy to connect with guests before, particularly if it helps to reassure them, and then particularly if it helps to build chemistry amongst a small group, to get the idea that we're going to enjoy this and we're looking forward to it. Crucially, golden rule, don't have your best conversation in the rehearsal call. It's absolutely critical that you don't, in my view, spend time having your best conversation in that prep call. Think about the arc of the conversation. Where would you like it to start, and roughly where would you like it to end up? Incredibly important. When you're starting to list those questions, either because you've come up with them or because you've been suggested them and you've made them your own, think to yourself as you start to list them, and I'll talk about how I do it, but as you start to list them, is this a question which I might either put to all guests, each and every one, which can be exhaustive? Is it a question that I might target to a specific individual? Or is it a question which I might open and offer to all of the guests? So I'm talking particularly here about panels. I've got more on panels. So start to think about that as you sketch out your notes. One to all, one to a specific by initial, or one to offer. Who will tell me their biggest challenge? What's keeping you all up at night? Okay. I personally put my notes on cards, particularly because the old-fashioned phrase on the cuff, I like to be able to scribble on the day my notes. If you're working with any sort of documents and you're being briefed as a compere or host, I would suggest you insist that they're shareable, updatable documents. No use 50 versions of a Word document flying around. It really does bog you down, particularly as the event changes in the last minute. Crucially important, where are they going to sit on the day? Look for your point person to ensure that the guests sit in exactly the right order that you've got on your card. I know this sounds very detailed, but it will really set your mind at rest if they all appear as you've planned. And it almost always, it often doesn't happen. So make an extra special request to whoever your point person is. Will you please help me ensure that everyone sits in the right order? I put names across my cue cards. So the names of the panel: Susan, Harry, Carla, Steve. And I put those names again and again through my script because I want to keep coming back visually to my visual cues of who I'm talking to. The worst thing you want to be doing is fumbling at the last minute for for reaching for somebody's name. Now we just got some noise coming from there. You go, that's brilliant thing. So keep coming back to names. Finally, I would think about any red lines for the conversation which you can discuss in advance. What do the speakers not wish to discuss? They will not talk about Brexit. They absolutely don't want to talk about their last company. I had that very recently. Please don't mention it. And you can honor that as a courtesy to the guests. So where can't you go? So that helps you understand the parameter of the conversation. So that's in terms of thoughts on prep. You might have lots of questions or some questions on that. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drop down to some specific tips, and I'm grateful for those who've sent questions on this because they've split into different chunks for emceeing and hosting panels. But I guess over the last 10 or 15 years, I've continued to make a note of these. I think one of the biggest questions you should ask, particularly when you're emceeing, who's going to introduce me? Who's going to introduce me? That sounds slightly sort of like performer-esque, but understand, are you going to be the first person up on that stage, or is somebody introducing you? And crucially, how? The way to get off to a great start at an event is to control how you're introduced by scripting it yourself in advance. And I know that might sound like a trade secret, but if you can write a couple of sentences of exactly how you'd like to be introduced, it will make you feel much better as you start an event. Who will introduce me, and send that to them in advance. I give recognition to the audience, whether virtually, and we will come on to some thoughts about virtual events, but I think recognizing the audience gets an event off to a great start. I'm delighted to see Janet Coyle here, Rod Banner, how lovely to see Gabrielle Lane Peters. Recognition, it might be individuals, it might be organizations. Great to see somebody here from Virgin Media, some of the world's most respected brands in the room. It gives that sense of comfort that the guest you're talking to is in the right room. This feels like a good start. I personally, my own choice is I tend to imagine I'm talking to one person when I'm particularly doing virtual events. I see a lot of people hosting virtual events where they're casting out and their tone seems to be talking to hundreds or thousands. I prefer just to try and imagine one person in my mind, and that's something that you might wish to do, but whatever suits you. I think the golden rule when you get up to MC, compare, host an event is to genuinely show that you are looking forward to what's about to happen. Show a genuine sense that you are enthused by what's to come, because I think that is absolutely infectious. And the way to look forward to it is obviously choice of gig in the first place, but through your preparation, a real deep dive that it's an honor to be about to share a stage. I'm not saying you need to say this, but I feel like that every time I do a gig. I'm genuinely excited about the people who are about to come up, and I can't wait to pass the mic to them. I also think that it's important here, and forgive me if this is too detailed, understand your transitions at every point. What are your transitions between sections? Are you handing straight on to the next chair? Is it to a commercial break? Is it just understand in your script, what are those transitions? Crucial rule, whenever you're introducing a guest on stage, don't over introduce them. You know, you can do someone a great disservice by saying the next speaker is one of the funniest people I've ever had the pleasure to meet. The next speaker is one of the most creative people in the entire world. You're not going to, understand whether the Olympian you're about to introduce intends to tell their own story and reveal their gold medals along the way, and to what extent they would appreciate you telling the audience that they won at Beijing or not. It's incredibly important. I see a lot of MCs, I've been guilty of it myself, over-introduced. Try not to do it. Finally, my own preferences, I try to end on somebody's name, their full name, when I'm introducing somebody. So I might say, so everybody, it's a delight to welcome to our stage here in London, the Chief Executive of Young Enterprise, Sharon Davies. That's the name in bold on your cue card. If you as an MC can hit that name on your transition, you will get them off to a great start. You'll cue the audience to applaud, and you'll feel much better about the whole process. So often you'll see compares saying, so then if Sharon, if you'd like to join us now, and it's all very strange in terms of a transition, right? In terms of virtual events, and this is an extraordinary Zoom, which I was hosting on my own, so please don't take rules from this session, but having worked with amazing production companies like Forgather, alongside London and Partners, the flagship event of London Tech Week, here's what I've taken away, and Silicon Valley comes to the UK, here's what I've taken away. At all costs, see the platform before the event. Ask for that rehearsal. I've just been on one with Business Leader, navigating the platform behind the scenes. How's it going to look and feel on the day? You don't want to be thrown by making someone a co-host, for example, at the last minute. Read your own writing. Be prepared, particularly virtual events now, be prepared to step in at any point. Okay, it is entirely possible when you as compare or MC that another chair will freeze, will go offline. It's happened so many times in the last year. I think no pressure, but I think if you're stepping up to compare an event in a digital world, you need to be prepared to pick up any panel. And I know that might sound quite overwhelming, but it has happened so many times. So understand what happens when a guest freezes, what happens if the chair drops off, be prepared to step in. Channel the audience on tech glitches. If you can't hear Sandra, there's a chance that everybody can't hear Sandra. So don't be afraid to take a hit personally and say, can everybody hear? I think we might have an issue with your line, Tom. Maybe we might just take a short break. Don't be afraid to channel the audience on tech glitches. Encourage contribution across all platforms, not just the events platform, not for today, but you might say, you know, this is our hashtag. We are very active across on LinkedIn. It helps the audience to join the dots. Consider using a good microphone. For just £100, you can get a Yeti. I use a Blue Yeti USB plugin. Really uplifts the quality of that conversation. Consider using a light. I use a ring light. Makes a big difference, especially when the sun's setting. It's a much gloomier day today. Totally transforms the picture. Obvious point, but try and get the camera as close to eye level and as flat as possible. I don't claim that this particular session is a masterclass in the above, but those techniques will really help you stand out over and above the crowd, particularly for gents. If you're finding the tendency to be a little bit shiny, I certainly can on the old bonce, consider getting or borrowing some powder and a brush to make that shininess a little bit less. It might sound too much information, but having had some pretty tough feedback, it certainly helped me on one or two occasions, I don't mind telling you. On virtual events, don't be afraid to understand in advance whether you know, you're going to be throwing to hand over to somebody. And here is, with a big drum roll, Mr. Andrew Scott. And then we hope that Andrew Scott will appear, one of our best investors I see on the call. And we hope that Andrew will appear or not. Or are you doing what I think of more of a spacewalk approach, which is, and here is Andrew Scott. Can you hear me, Andrew? And only after we've linked and connected do I let him go off on his own spacewalk. So I think for virtual events, understanding, is it a throw or is it handover, is crucial. And so many events would be better if those transitions had been thought through. As a host for a virtual event, your job is to channel the organizer. Your guests coming in and out won't have the opportunity to thank the speakers that they would in the real world. So that's your job, back in the green room, in the virtual green room, to express that gratitude, to give them the positive feedback, the reassurance that they did a great job. You are the representative of the organization as the MC of a virtual event. So you have to amp it up much more than you would, I think, in physical events. Finally, agree on timings. Are you going to run strictly to the clock? If something should run over, a keynote, is your job to get back on the clock, on the Greenwich Mean Time clock, or does the event have permission? Sorry if this is too detailed. Does the event have permission to slide? Okay, really crucial distinction. Okay, your organizer, your host, your organizing organization might say, no, 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 we need to get back on the clock. The next session must start at 11:30, come what may, or there's a lot of give in the program. We'll just push it. Totally different, because many future guests might have a direct in or a direct out, particularly government ministers, where they have to be gone. So really important to know that. I'm going to talk a little bit about physical events, and I'm conscious we will be leaving lots of time for questions. Jess, let me pause briefly, because I'm going to imagine us going into a new physical world of the future and the past. How are we doing, Jess Butcher?
Yeah, great. We've got lots of interesting questions. I suspect you're going to cover some of them. So a lot of questions around the new hybrid world, some questions around what to do when everything goes wrong, and to some of the points you've already raised around sort of energy levels. I thought there was a great question around how to make panels zing. Yeah. You know, when things fall a little flat. So let's carry on and then see how much of that you cover, and then we can bring some of those questions in perhaps later.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, why don't I just jump straight to that on panel events, because I think that's you know, a crucial thing. Look, I think I can say amongst friends, the simple truth is that when you ask someone a question at a panel event, the first answer you get normally isn't very good. Okay, now that might be because of nerves, it might be because somebody's just starting to warm up, lots of reasons. Okay, the vast majority of hosts, in my opinion, stop after they've got their first answer, as if they're conducting some sort of police inquiry. Thank you very much, no further questions, and move on. Okay, I think the best hosts listen to a first answer and aren't afraid to go back in for more. Is it clarification? Most usefully, I find, top technique I use, ask them to bring something they've just said to life. That's very interesting, John. Have you got an example of where that's happened? Can you help us bring that to life? Can you help us imagine that a little bit? Your first answer you get will often not be good. Go back in. Absolute golden rule. Think about whether you're going to direct a particular question at one, at all, or to offer. Channel at all times the audience. What are the audience likely to be thinking? It might be, I have no idea what you've just said. You know, you could choose to present that view in a slightly cheeky way if you wanted. They might be saying, what does FPA stand for? Yeah, it could say, look, just to absolutely clarify, what is it in terms of actually the core of the business? Just remind us what it is. Right? Okay. Any of those things, be thinking all the time, not what am I thinking as the host, as the MC, but what's Gabrielle likely to be thinking sat in the third row? Okay. Is she going to be getting bored at this point? Do we need to switch up the energy? Is she thinking, what did that mean? Or, you know, channel the audience all the time is your number one role when you're up there hosting that panel. Invite your guests before and on stage if you need to break the walls between their fellow panelists. Okay, there's a great tendency to channel everything through the moderator, through the host. Encourage them, particularly in virtual events, to go from side to side, to pick up on something someone else has said, to riff, to look around. That will start to build energy and build momentum. So don't be afraid to build that rapport amongst the guests and give them that permission in advance. Switching gear, hugely important in panel conversations. Don't be afraid to tell them that's what you're doing. Right, we're going to switch things up a bit. We're going to switch gear. In fact, I'm just looking for a one-word answer, hyped or overhyped or whatever it might be, you know, zero or hero. You know, what's keeping you up at night, really? And I would actually say, and I'm going to encourage you to keep these next answers incredibly pithy. Don't be afraid to shift gear. Physical events are coming back onto the horizon, and here are the things that I wish I'd known about those physical events. I'm going to race through them. The team on the day, lights, sound, person looking after the coat check. If you have as your golden rule to treat all of them as VVIPs, treat them as if they own the organization, they own the building. Not only will it make them feel better, but it will make you feel completely supported throughout. And I can't underestimate that. If I could put one tip out there, it would be to treat them like royalty throughout the whole experience. And you'll just feel like part of a team immediately. And it's something for speakers, for MCs, for hosts. It really builds that sense of camaraderie. Try and see the space either before the day or on the day. Just have a peek, understand the logistics of the space. But crucially, your job standing on that stage is to hit the back. Okay, that doesn't mean to shout, but it means that the person standing by the pillar at the back has to feel connected. So it's important for you not just to see the back from the stage, but also to see the stage from the back. So have a mooch around the venue. Understand what that microphone and stage looks like from the furthest table in the house. I think it's incredibly important. In terms of people putting me off, making me feel a little bit nervous, I have a rule where I always try and meet Mr. Grumpy. Mr. Grumpy is the meanest, grumpiest, saddest looking person in the whole place, normally sitting on their own, sometimes with a bag at their feet. I go and introduce myself because if I don't, that presence could put me off for the whole of the opening or the whole of the event. Here's the simple punchline. Mr. or Mrs. Grumpy, 10 times out of 10, turns out to be lovely. They've had a journey, they've had a challenging morning. We connect as two humans, we cheer each other up, we have a laugh, we have a joke about the event, about the conversation. I leave feeling 10 times better about the event, and I've exercised that particular demon from my mind about who might be lurking in the audience. So don't be afraid. I'm not suggesting you go swanning the venue right up until you're on, but connecting with audience members makes it so powerful. If you can do that throughout a room, when you get up on that stage, it will feel more like a reunion. It will lift your spirits, it will lift their spirits. I wish I'd done that 15 years ago when I started connecting, because otherwise I was running all sorts of other stories in the back of my mind. Understanding on the day, what makes you feel better? Is it a new shirt? Is it some new shoes? Break them in. Wear 2 pairs of socks would be my recommendation. But what will give you that lift on the day? Use those techniques to make you feel great about the event. Finally, just some brief thoughts, and then we'll stop for some questions on broader tips and techniques when you're hosting and when you're encouraging other people to host. I personally prefer to work with a structure which I can then riff around. So I know the structure of my panels and of my day, but I know I can improvise. Typically, politicians make the mistake that the only improv they do is right at the top of their contribution, and everything else is downhill and boring from there. Have those slots in the day where you can riff around your structure. I prefer to do a panel where, particularly for intros of all guests, I will do a rapid intro, ask for applause, and then walk around. And again, forgive me if this is too detailed, but I would say my guests today are Jess, Neil, Pete, and Neve. Let's give them all a round of applause. And I would probably say their organizations, but quick name check and organization check, round of applause gets the room rising up to greet them, and the guests feel good. Right. Now, in terms of what I then tend to do, I say, Jess, you're a serial entrepreneur. You created Blipper, huge VR story, and you're now splitting your time, it sounds to me. Jess might then pick up on that. In other words, I prefer that as an approach to saying, Jess, would you mind just introducing yourself? I prefer it, particularly because too many events get off with such, not from Jess Butcher, thank goodness, but get off with such rambling panel introductions that we've lost the will to live before we've asked the first question. So don't be afraid to chuck them something about them and get them to build on that, particularly where their answer could then be starting, yes, that's right, and you get them to build on that. Don't be afraid to mix it up. You don't have to go 1, 2, 3, 4 when you're introducing or when you're asking the questions. The worst thing I think hosts can do is go in numerical order for every question. It's so boring. It's so predictable. Don't be afraid to shake it up. Why don't we bring Neil in at this point from the Southwest? How lovely to see Neil. We've grabbed him from the end of the panel. All of a sudden, we've confounded our guests' expectations, and we feel we've kept them on their toes, and in a good way, the panel on their toes as well. The golden rule when you're hosting any sort of panel discussion is listen, listen, listen. Almost all of your best questions on the day will come from something the guest said on the day. So I'm not undermining preparation. That helps you feel good. Eisenhower said, plans are useless. Planning is everything. Buy into that. Great. On the day, listen, 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 listen obsessively to what someone's saying. Listen for those gems and go back in for them. So those are lots of thoughts, particularly on the day, and perhaps we can get into more around fireside chats, on breaking in and getting to do more gigs in the first place. Jess, let's cut to questions in 2 minutes. I think my final thoughts on this whole scene would be nothing will beat practice. Nothing will beat practice. So if you ever feel that you might have an opportunity to have a go, to stand up, to introduce some speeches at a birthday or for an anniversary of someone in the organization, to welcome people to a small gathering, throw your hat in the ring, offer to MC, offer to chair, but crucially, if you've got a close circle of colleagues, friends, a kitchen cabinet, if you like, share your ambitions. You don't need to put it out on LinkedIn or Twitter if you don't feel comfortable. Start to say to some colleagues over the next few months or years, I'd love to start doing some more hosting and sharing. Sow that seed in their mind, because in so many cases, they'll think to themselves, A, I think you'd be good at that, but B, I wouldn't have thought of that, but you'd be good at that. So you're planting the seed in their mind. And then finally, mark a few cards. If there are organizations you'd like to do some hosting and emceeing and comparing with, tell them that. Tell them you admire them. I got into a very lazy position where all of my work was coming through word of mouth. And I suddenly realized, how many things am I missing out on? How can I write to organizations or tell them as I cross paths with them that I'd love to support them in future? So I started doing that, and everything started getting far more varied and interesting for me from that point on. The final point, Jess, is get feedback, and it's something we've talked about a lot. I think you have to ask for feedback. And my goodness, I'll be doing it after this. I think you have to ask for feedback 3 times. The first time you ask a friend or colleague for feedback, they'll say, you were fabulous, darling. And they think that's what you want to hear. You go back, you say, no, but really, I'd like to tell you what you thought of my presenting at that awards or that panel or that conference, okay? The second time, they'll give you a gist of how they felt. It's only when you really clarify, saying, I want you to be completely candid, completely honest. I promise I won't be offended. I recognize that I have to get much better at this. Then they'll start to give you critical feedback, okay? If you ever feel that you've peaked, I would suggest you haven't. You've probably plateaued. So find additional support, coaches like Alex Merry, on any aspect of your performance. So for me, you know, having just hungered on that for years, giving people full permission to give you both barrels afterwards, but they'll do it with love and warmth. And that is absolutely the crucial feedback loop that we all need. Jess.
That was fabulous, Oli. And indeed, you did, I think, touch on many of the questions that we've had in the chat. But I do want to draw a few out. I particularly like to think it was Lorraine and Anne who asked some interesting questions about what to do when you're, I guess, caught but with people responding in ways that might be derailing. So helpful one-liners to shut people up. That was a request. And also, how do you prevent, and this, by the way, is a big Clubhouse challenge, how do you prevent the, this is more a comment than a question monologue that typically comes from the room? I'll give you that one first.
Well, I mean, my controversial view on the second is I welcome reflections from the floor. So actually, sometimes rambling questions leading to rambling answers can be worse than saying, well, that's what our panel thinks, but what hasn't been said? What's on your mind? And then the only thing you then tend to encourage is brevity. So saying, look, we've got a lot to get through, and I'm note to self here. We say, so what I'm encouraging from the floor, it might be a question, you might choose to direct it at the whole panel or just to one of them, or you might have a reflection on what's been said or not been said. But I would encourage you to keep your answers as pithy as possible. Let's go. So that's on that first one. And I think then, I think physicality comes into it a lot in events, in terms of, I don't mean just sort of slightly traffic cop, wait, you know, but being able to encourage, but in a way that cuts off. So as somebody as Neil, I'm picking on Neil because I can see him, he wouldn't do this, but if he's in full flow, I say, absolutely great, thank you, Neil. And then we've got Neil's contribution. So don't be afraid to thank them for making a great point, but everybody, including the guests, will know that you are signaling the end of that bit of their contribution. It doesn't always work, but it often really, really does. And by the way, I would also signal that you want more from them on that subject and others as we go along. So I'll say, thank you, Annie. That's fantastic. Lots more to ask you on that. So Annie doesn't feel bruised by that.
Next, sort of clustering, and you have touched upon this, but I think it might be helpful to do a bit more depth. I think a lot of people seem concerned about this sort of pre-planned questions versus free flow. And I think related to that is that how to truly listen without getting distracted by what you want to say next or the flow that you might have envisaged beforehand. And I think this is something that, you know, a lot of the questions touch on this, and I guess sort of insecurity around how you might handle that situation. I don't know if you have anything more to add on that.
Yeah, I think there are two things. I think there's a tangent, like ways lead on to other ways. Yeah, and there's a slight difference between those two. There's one which is effectively a complete re-railing of a panel or an interview. That's one thing. Fine, we could be open to that. But then there's the brief riffing or tangential conversation where you then bring it back onto the plan. So I just noticed there's a difference between those. I conducted 4 one-hour interviews this week on film. And in all of those cases, I allowed for riffs around and extensions, but I came back to my sequence and my arc to do the interview. So in practical terms, Jess, I think one thing that can really help you in this is, if not sharing the questions, which I don't tend to recommend, sharing the arc of the interview with your panel or your interviewee. Yeah, particularly for a fireside chat. So, for example, Sarah might have spent time in Afghanistan. I want Sarah to know that I want to cover that. And I might even hint to Sarah that I'll be doing that a bit later on in the interview. In other words, she might then start to bump up against that and reference it early on in our interview. But if I've given her sight of the fact that I want to cover that, then 9 times out of 10, then your guest will respect the fact that you are planning to get to that. A bit like in any questions where they know there's going to be a question about exam results, right? Does that make sense, Jess?
Yes. And related to that, what happens when things really go wrong? You know, a power cut was mentioned in one instance, or, you know, just things are out of sequence. And I think a lot of what you talked about was the importance of prep in managing your own expectations, not just of layout of room, but of where people are sitting, you know, the timetable. But then surely things go wrong. What is the best approach and strategy for that?
Well, I think number one, understand in advance of the event. And I'm very conscious that we're sort of flying slightly solo in this one, which is great. But traditionally, in particularly virtual events, but also physical events, understand what your channels are mid-event, when you're up in flight, if you like. What are your channels? What methods are the team going to use to communicate with you? Because what you don't want is them coming over the event tannoy, talking you through it. So typically for me, that might be WhatsApp. So I'll have a channel on WhatsApp. It might be another screen to filter some questions so I can remain completely fixed on the camera. So work out what your channels are, number one. Number two, work out what your fallback options are. I hosted 2 days of live events for Elite Business Live 2 weeks ago, and I knew that we could effectively go to the advert card at any point with the traditional queue. We're just going to resolve that and we'll be back very shortly. And I knew that that was a fallback that wasn't going to spook the team. So they had that up their sleeve. In a live event environment, you might have much more challenges. And funny enough, me understanding the difference, whether this signal means keep talking or this signal means you need to wrap up, is incredibly worthwhile. So I think always having some material in your back pocket if you need to fill. Also, I really do think this, leveling with the audience, just to be able to say, I'm not quite sure what's happening here. We seem to have an issue with Tom's line coming out of Boston. We're going to try and get it sorted. Oh, Tom, you're there. Yeah. So I had a guest, Charlie Mullins, coming in from Dubai, Pimlico Plumbers. You know, we had 10 minutes where his connection wasn't working. So in the end, I got his son, Scott, up on the stage. We had a short fireside chat for 10 minutes and then we could patch him back in. But that wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't established my number one comms channel was Earset for that live event. My second channel was a screen in front of me. Just understand with the team, how are we going to talk to each other in any glitch scenario?
Great. There were some questions actually about physicality. Somebody asked a question about breathing techniques. Priya also mentioned, you know, if you're doing a virtual event, do you get any value from standing up, for example? Have you been trained in sort of physical techniques? Do you have any advice for how those should be harnessed in digital and physical events?
Yeah, well, one thing I love is that, for example, with Clubhouse, you know, I love the fact that I can stand up and walk around for it. So I probably don't do it as much in virtual events. I had some fantastic training. It lasted 2 days with an organization. Sadly, they've disbanded, called Naked Apes, about 10 years ago. And it was quite theatrical, actually, on projection, on presence, because so much of what we talk about in hosting and presenting is about what is said rather than how it is said. So there are some amazing coaches. Alex Merry would be one. In terms of presentations, they work with Apple and TED, the main organization. Missing Link out of South Africa would be another. Edie Lush, how to speak confidently in public, fantastic coach. David McQueen. So I would talk about certain speaker coaches who will work with you as much on how you say it as what you say. For me, the physicality is hugely important, the ability to stretch, literally physically stretch before an event, and to get in the zone, to understand that if I swan, the Butlins phrase, with the audience for too long in advance of it, I won't have a clear enough head to do what I need to do. That ability to check in with the guests briefly, to reassure them, to make that human connection in the green room, physical or virtual, before the event, hugely important. And yes, here we go, let's put it alongside the powder fact, but I think that having a certain song that gets you in the mood, gets you in the zone, can make a huge difference. So I will, particularly for physical events, it'll just remind me that we're going off to a really exciting thing, and that in 2 minutes will get me far more mentally prepared. But hopefully there are some useful techniques.
Fabulous. Another theme is energy. And Andrew's just asked a great question about what happens when you've got the graveyard slot and the lack of energy, you know, at that time. And you talked about a lot about shifting the mood. have you got any tangible examples? You do this excellently, so I have observed you do it, but have you got any really good examples for techniques that people can do to sort of inject a little bit more excitement and passion into a room and an audience?
Yeah, I think, for me, but being true, being honest with your audience, about calling it out, going, my high energy point of the day, the 4 p.m. slot, excellent, gosh. So might get a little chuckle, but at least you're saying, warning, this could lag, but don't worry, I'm here to ensure it doesn't. So you can sort of, what you don't want to be doing is then channeling that yourself, right? I use some pretty American techniques. Janet Coyle will know, Priya will know, brilliant Priya Guha, Merriam Partners, and backing lots of fantastic women founders. I use a wake and shake technique a lot. So let's just get everybody up. And I know that gets some people rolling their eyes, but actually at the right time, people have short attention spans. Let's get them up out of their chairs. And rather than setting them a little question, why don't you tell your neighbor what your favorite food is? I would say something far more open, like, why don't we just turn to the person next to us? Feel free to stand up if you want to, or if you're able to, and just tell them what you make of the show so far. And it's just a rush of noise, a rush of energy. It just releases it. So being able to, and having permission from your organizer to put those in can really make a big difference. So to do that wake and shake. The other techniques is just shifting gears on that. So you get a really pithy, let's say a one-word start from each of the guests to a panel, just set off in an unexpected direction. The other thing, which I've not abided by on this call, Jess, is go to questions much earlier than you think. Yeah, go to questions. So get a first 10 minutes out of your panel, out of your session, and then go, this is already fantastic, Sarah. Let's get a few questions going. And don't be afraid to wait for some answers, because too many hosts will go, let's get some questions. None? Okay, right, back to the plan. Yeah, wait, let it sit for 30 seconds. Questions will emerge. So go to questions sooner than you think.
Thanks. I'm conscious of time. Do you want to finish on the dot?
I would like to draw a close on the dot. I won't go anywhere. So I'm very happy to stick around if you are, just for another 10 minutes, but let's have a form of close at 12.
Okay. In which case there's quite a few questions about the virtual and hybrid world, which I think if we start on, will definitely take us over that time. But there are two very critical points that I want to make. The one question was, why the 2 pairs of socks, Oli?
Because if you've got a new pair of shoes, and I'll often buy not Jimmy Choos or anything, but if you've got a new pair of shoes and you've got 1 pair of socks, you can end up hobbling at the end of the day.
Very great. And a fabulous point that Priya has raised. What do you need, Oli? What can we, who are all so gratefully sitting here learning from you on a pro bono session that you've volunteered your time for, how can we help you with something that you're interested in pursuing or want to do at the moment?
Oh, bless you. That's a very generous question. I honestly think, you can help me by encouraging whoever the organizations you're working with to think more deeply about how they bring people together. And that could be creatively about connecting audiences. It could be about who they feature on stage, particularly. I tell you one thing. I think communication skills are important, but they're not the only thing. So I would ask the question, how can we get people whose brains are wired differently to share their voices and to share their talents? And I've got a very, very strong passion about this at the moment, because I think we exclude so many voices because they haven't got what normal society would think would be the gift of the gab. And I think it's an urgent problem, especially in tech at the moment. And I think so. Anyway, if anyone would like to help me think of how we get more talent sharing their voices and their stories across generations, then that will light me up.
Amazing. I think the conclusion is pass it on, right? That's the mantra that
Pass the mic.
He's given his time in this session. Everybody should feel emboldened to pass it on in whatever form they have when it comes to the knowledge that they have to impart with the world.
A final thought, and a thanks to you, Jess, a final thought on breaking in. A lot of people I know want to do more of this, or know someone who wants to do more of this. Just final, less than a minute. You won't get your chat show on BBC on day one, but what you might do is get given a panel opportunity. A chance to show yourself, a break, if you like. There are so many opportunities to break into events and emceeing, for chairing that one session, for being that star panelist. So think about where those breaks might appear. Lots of events with lots of chairs need an MC. They've forgotten to cast an MC. You could be that MC to help that golden thread through an event. Lots of events with MCs need chairs. My goodness, I need it all the time. Someone to pick up that panel mid-morning and just lift it with their different type of energy. So you could be a chair that fits into an MC event. Create your own gathering, particularly for your own organization. Cast yourself as the host. What amazing practice that is, you know, having done it so many times. Finally, interesting and provocative, I know, but consider giving that time, particularly to a cause you believe in, saying, look, if I could help you MC that fundraiser, that gathering you've got coming up, I'd be happy to. So consider giving to gain something in that environment. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I'm just going to stick around with Jess, if that's all right, just to shoot the breeze, but thank you. And please encourage, let's encourage more voices. And I'd love to hear what you've thought about this. So please drop me a note. I'm Oli at olibarrett.com, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. If you think there are useful things we can do with this content, please, I'm all ears. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.